The Munich Security Conference has kicked off at its traditional venue as Russia appears to be preparing for a military incursion into Ukraine. The gathering brings together heads of state, diplomats and business leaders of the world for 3 days of meetings on global security issues. Now, previously the talks have been about faraway crises like Afghanistan, Iraq or Iran. But this year the talks will focus on Europe itself, as Ukraine faces a potentially catastrophic invasion. The world leaders have assembled at the Bayerischer Hof Hotel in Munich for the annual security meet. The 3-day event has been named as Davos for Defence, which will also include a panel discussion on climate change. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, US Vice President Kamala Harris and NATO's Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg are among the top dignitaries attending the meeting. The head of the security conference, Wolfgang Ischinger, has delivered his opening remarks, followed by the United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres.
This is perhaps, I think, the single most important conference during my 14 years as chairman. We have seen our fair share of crises over this last decade or decade and a half, from the economic crisis to the sudden eruption in the Arab Spring, the violent conflicts in Syria and Libya, and then on to the illegal annexation of Crimea, the conflict in Donbass, and so on and so forth. We've seen turbulent times in the transatlantic relationship, and most recently and currently we are witnessing a threatening military buildup in the western part of Russia against Ukraine.
I'm often asked whether we are in a new Cold War. My answer is that the threat to global security now is more complex and probably higher than at that time. During much of the Cold War, there were mechanisms that enabled the protagonists to calculate risks and use back channels to prevent crises. Today, many of those systems no longer exist, and most of the people trained to use them are no longer here with us. So miscommunication and miscalculation can make a minor incident between powers escalate out of control, causing incalculable harm. With the concentration of Russian forces around Ukraine, I am deeply concerned about heightened tensions and increased speculation about a military conflict in Europe. I still think it will not happen. But if it did, it would be catastrophic.
Meanwhile, Russia has announced massive drills of its nuclear forces as tensions continue to escalate over Ukraine. It comes at a time when the US has issued some of its starkest warnings to date, detailing how a Russian invasion of Ukraine might unfold. Russian President Vladimir Putin will personally oversee Saturday's exercises. It will involve multiple practice launches of both ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. According to the Kremlin, Putin will oversee the drills from the Situation Room. As for the practice missile launches, he will supervise those himself.
Although Russia has announced that it is moving its forces back to garrison, we have yet to see that. In fact, we see more forces moving into that region, that border region. And we also see them going through, continuing to prepare by doing things that you would expect elements to do, military elements to do, as they were preparing to launch an attack.
About all of this? Well, the military alliance is planning to set up new battle groups. These will be located in Central, Eastern and Southeastern Europe. One of them will be led by France in Romania. While NATO has ruled out sending troops to fight Russia in Ukraine, troops have been sent to bolster the defences of Eastern European member countries. The US also announced the planned sale of 250 Abrams tanks to Poland. This as Washington moves to strengthen the defences of the key Eastern European ally. It follows the deployment of nearly 5,000 additional US troops to Poland. Warsaw has had a long and traumatic history of Russian aggression, and as such is one of the most hawkish NATO members in confronting Russia. US President Joe Biden has ruled out deploying US forces to fight in Ukraine. But deployments to Poland could mean that US and Russian troops will be in close proximity.
In response to Poland's formal request in July of 2021, Secretary Blinken and I have relayed our intent to Congress to offer Poland the opportunity to acquire 250 M1A2 Abrams main battle tanks. The time frame for delivery of these tanks is currently under discussion. This is the most modern version of the Abrams and will provide Poland with a highly advanced tank capability.
Well, to bring us more on this story, we can go now live to Susan Tirani, who's joining us in New York City. Susan, what is the US trying to achieve out of the Munich security conference that's taking place?
Well, Nick, all eyes and ears will be on, from the U.S. side at least, Vice President Kamala Harris and U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. Harris is expected to really take to this conference to once again reassert America's commitment to NATO and try to rally European allies in committing to taking a united stance against Russia in case of an incursion, and really continue to further and strengthen that eastern flank that Lloyd Austin has been hammering on during the past week. A very important discussion will be with Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and also a senior administration official also described the vice president's trip and her key objectives as being three prolonged focuses, and one of them being, quote, the fast-changing situation on the ground. The United States diplomats, their hope, led by Harris, hope to discuss that and maintain full alignment with partners, and also send a clear message to Russia that the U.S. prefers diplomacy but is ready against any form of Russian aggression. Officials did not go into full detail on what America's contingency plan is should Russia decide to stage that incursion. And I think that's the million-dollar question, is whether or not there is a plan when U.S. officials led by Kamala Harris and Tony Blinken, when they're at this conference, if Russia decides to invade, then what does the United States hope to achieve at the Munich conference?
And Susan, what could be the Biden administration's next move, considering it seems convinced that a Russian invasion is imminent?
Yeah, and just falling back to those previous comments by the senior administration officials, President Biden has really tried to push back on making any commitment, at least militarily. One, because there is really no appetite for that here in the United States because of its domestic audience, and secondly, because he's just fallen back on diplomacy, and it seems to have worked for now. Whether or not it's to keep Vladimir Putin off balance with this policy that he has of exposing these intelligence without providing evidence on the one hand, and on the other hand,
what am I reading next?
Diplomatic calls on the other, first with his European allies, and then with Vladimir Putin himself, albeit very short, and then thirdly, really coming out and demonstrating that he is in line when it comes to intelligence sharing and keeping his allies in the loop, as opposed to the time when really that wasn't the case, notably during his first year in office, at least regarding his image, and after the withdrawal of Afghanistan. So he's really fallen back on the diplomatic front. He says sanctions will be the first line of action. But, you know, a lot of analysts are wondering whether or not that will be enough and what will happen if sanctions are imposed and Russia does decide to invade. But administration officials are not talking about America's contingency plans as of now.
Thank you, Susan. That was Susan Tarani joining us live from New York City.